Hello and welcome to Project Pro. My name is Ashay and in this video we are going to discuss about what is SQL, NoSQL and the differences between them. We are also going to see the different types of data like structured data, semi-structured data as well as the unstructured data, and also we will see how we can select a right type of database for your application using the CAP theorem. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's get started with our comparison. So in this video, you'll get a thorough understanding of what is SQL, what is the difference between structured, semi-structured as well as unstructured data. Then we'll discuss about what is NoSQL and why it is popular nowadays. And also we are going to compare different NoSQL databases using the CAP theorem, which is a very important concept in the world of big data. So first, let's talk about what is SQL. So I guess everyone should know about this, right? The SQL is the structured query language and it is a programming language for storing and processing the information in a relational databases. So relational database stores the information in a tabular format. So tabular means you can relate it to the Excel sheet where the data is stored in the rows and column manner, and it represents the different data attributes and the various relationship between these data values. So you can use like a different SQL queries for storing, updating, removing or retrieving the information from the database. And you can use SQL to also maintain and optimize your SQL performance. But let's discuss why SQL is very important. So it is very popular query language and it is very frequently used in different types of applications around the globe. So data analysts as well as the developers will use SQL because it integrates well with different programming language. And everyone knows that SQL is also fairly very easy to learn and implement in the real world use cases. But that comes to the second point. We'll now see what is structured, semi-structured and unstructured data. So as you already know that SQL handles the structured data which is stored inside the tabular format. But what really is a semi-structured data? So in the big data world, the structured, semi-structured or unstructured data terms are frequently used. So these are basically the classification of data that are now very important to understand because of the rapid increase of semi-structured and the unstructured data today, as well as the different tools that are developed which manages and analyze these classes of the data. So the first one is the easiest and everyone is knowing that the structured data, which is a very easy to search and organize, and it contains the rows and columns which is then mapped into a fixed predefined fields. It is known as the structured data. So as I already told you that you can take an example of an Excel spreadsheet which is like a structured data, and structured data can follow a data model which a database designer will create. So because of these reasons, structured data is very easy to store, analyze as well as search, and until recently was the only data which is easily usable for businesses. But in today's world, most estimated structured data accounts for only less than 20% of all the data which is available, which is very shocking to us because SQL seems to be the very popular and very established language in the big data world. But there are the new competitors in the business which are NoSQL. So for that, let's discuss what is semi-structured data. So beyond the structured data, there is a second category which is like the mix of the structured and the unstructured data. And this data has some defining, or we can say it as the consistent characteristic, but doesn't confirm any structure as rigid as we have seen in the structured data. So therefore, many Fortune 500 companies have migrated to NoSQL databases because of their evolving schema and ease of use in the today's agile development work. So let's take an example of email. So the email seems to be the unstructured data, but it does contain a structured data such as name, the email address of the sender as well as the recipients and the timestamp on which you sent some email. So that we can call it as a semi-structured data. Or else any JSON document in a real world is also a type of semi-structured data. But now let's discuss about unstructured data. So in the whole world, the bigger percentage of all the data which is available is the unstructured data. So data cannot be contained in a row column database and doesn't have any associated schema to it. So things like the text of any messages you sent is like unstructured data. So, because of this lack of structured, it is very difficult to search, manage as well as analyze, and there are many companies who don't even use unstructured data because of the artificial intelligence and the machine learning algorithms. It makes very easier to work with the unstructured data as well. So in today's world, that is the reason semi-structured data and the unstructured data are getting evolved, because most of the data is generated in the whole world comes through these two categories. So it does make sense to get some meaning out of them. And in today's advancement, these two have become more popular than the structured data. So now let's discuss how to handle the semi-structured data. And the answer is simple: NoSQL, which is not only SQL databases. So what are those and why it is different than SQL? So now let's discuss that. So NoSQL databases are like a non-tabular database and stores the data very differently than the relational tables. So these databases comes in a variety of types and their data models that we are going to see further. So when people uses this term like the NoSQL databases, they typically use it to refer any non-relational databases. So some says that it stands for non-SQL, where others says that it is a not only SQL. So either way, most agree that NoSQL databases are databases which stores the data in a format other than the relational tables. That is very important topic. So each NoSQL databases has its unique different features. So at high level, many NoSQL databases have the features like the flexible schema. So it doesn't have any fixed number of columns for every entry in the database. Entry means you can call it as a row. So if you talk about SQL, then each row should have the values for each column in the database. But there is not such restriction in case of NoSQL. So if you talk about a document, any document can have multiple key value pairs, and these key value pairs doesn't have any fixed schema, and you can have like the 4 key value pairs in one document as well as 10 key value pairs in the another document in the same table or the collection. So it gives us the flexibility to evolve our schema over time. And the main use of NoSQL databases is the horizontal scalability. So in the world where the data is generating at the petabyte level, horizontal scalability makes more sense than the vertical scalability. And it has also the benefit of fast querying due to this type of data model. And as you can evolve the schema over time, it gives the ease of use for every developer in the big data world. So that is the reason NoSQL is very popular nowadays among every organization in the world, and many Fortune 500 companies have really migrated their workloads on the NoSQL databases already. But there are some concepts that you have to cover, like the CAP Theorem, which we are going to discuss in this video, which will give you the thorough understanding of the 3 guarantees of every database, which is the consistency, availability, and the partition tolerance.
Before moving forward, if you are enjoying this video, I'd really like your feedback. So please leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel for further videos.
So now let's talk about different types of NoSQL databases that are available in the market. So the first one is a key value stores. So this is like the simplest type of NoSQL database. So in this case, every data element in your database is stored as a key value pair, which consists of an attribute name and a value. So which means that a key value store is like a relational databases with only 2 columns. So the key, like the designation, and the value would be the developer. So this was just an example. Then there is a column based database. So while the relational databases stores the data in rows and reads the data row by row. So when you submit any SQL query, you are directly scanning a whole table row by row. But a column store is organized as a set of columns. So which means that when you want to run any analytics query on top of your data, you can read those columns directly without consuming memory with unwanted data. So let's say if you have like 100 columns in your table and you just wanna need like 5 columns in your analytics query, then it will only read the data from those 5 columns and not will scan the whole rows one by one in your database, which it does in the relational databases. So that's why column based databases are very useful for read and write extensions. And these column-based databases is highly adopted in the market right now. So some of those examples are the Cassandra as well as the Edge-based, which is native to Hadoop ecosystem. Then there is a document-based database, which is again very popular database available right now. So this document database stores the data in the JSON-like format. So the document and this document can be nested. So this can be stored and retrieved in the form that is much closer to the data objects used in the application, which totally means that the less transaction is required to use that data in the application. So these document databases are very popular among the developers because they have a flexibility to rework their document structure as needed to suit different types of applications. So this flexibility will speed the development process because data comes like a code and it is under control of developers. But in SQL databases, intervention by the database administrators may be required for changing the structure of the databases. So that is a huge con of every SQL database. So MongoDB is a very popular document database in the world right now. And we also have the last one, which is again very popular, graph database. So the graph databases will really focuses on the relationship between the data elements. So each element is stored as a node, such as like a person will be the node in a social media graph. So if you have like the graph for all the users in Facebook, then each person should represent each node in your cluster. So in graph databases, the connections are the first class elements of the databases which are directly stored. But in relational databases, links are implied using the data to express that relationship. So the graph database is very popular nowadays because it is optimized for capturing and searching the connections between these data elements, and it overcomes the overhead associated with joining multiple tables in SQL. That's why for performing the use cases like a recommendation engine or the fraud detection, that's where graph databases are superior and way more optimized than the SQL databases, or we can say RDBMS. So these were like the most popular types of NoSQL databases. But you have to first understand what is the difference between NoSQL and the SQL databases and what makes NoSQL databases shine as compared to the SQL database. So let's discuss about that now. So the concept of NoSQL is not well defined and can refer to many databases, which we have just seen. So now let's compare about the SQL and NoSQL in these different categories. The first one is the model. So I hope you all know that SQL's model is a relational which stores the data in a tabular format. So the NoSQL, the model is non-relational, which means it stores the data either in the JSON documents or the key value pairs or as the columns or the graphs. So these types you have already discussed. So now let's talk about the data. So in SQL, every record will have the same attributes. So if you have like 10 columns in your relational table, then each row should have values for every column in a database. You cannot have 11 values or 9 values in your row. When you're inserting the data, you have to insert exactly 10 rows in your database. And even if you are filling the null values or the empty values, that also you have to mention while inserting the data. But in case of NoSQL, it will offer you an immense flexibility that each record can have different attributes. So that is the reason the SQL databases are suitable more for the structured data, and the NoSQL databases are suited for the non-relational data or the semi-structured data. So if you talk about the schema, it is very straightforward. SQL will have the fixed schema and the NoSQL will be having the flexible schema. So in the agile development, having the flexible schema will improve the productivity of your developers, and you will be deploying the features more rapidly if you compare it to SQL databases, because it will not have any involvement of the administrators, and your developers only can handle all these changes because it already comes out of the box with a flexible schema. So if we talk about the transactions, it is a very important aspect. So the NoSQL databases supports the ACID transactions. So if you know about SQL, ACID properties are nothing but the atomicity, consistency, isolation, and the durability. Atomicity means The transaction is nothing but an atomic unit of the process, and it should either be performed entirely or not perform at all. These operations are very important to maintain the integrity within your database. The next one will be the consistency, which means that it is completely executed from beginning to end without any interference from other transaction, and it should take the database from one consistent state to the other, which means the consistency preservation of the database. And when it comes to isolation means that any transaction should not be interfered with other transactions which are executing concurrently. And durability means that the changes applied to any database by the committed transaction should persist in the database. So SQL databases are ACID compliant, but in NoSQL it totally depends on the different solutions and your application. But when talk about the consistency and the availability, SQL will provide you the strong consistency which is prioritized over availability and the performance. So if you need only the strong consistency enforced in your application, then there is a no-brainer. You have to choose SQL over NoSQL. But you need a very highly available solution, you should choose NoSQL, because NoSQL databases are generally very highly available if we compared it to the relational databases. And when it comes to performance, NoSQL will win here, because in SQL the insert and update operations totally depends on the disk input and output speed. But in NoSQL you will have the flexibility to maximize the performance by reducing the consistency of your databases. And if you want to scale that database with your growing data, then there is a no-brainer, because NoSQL databases are highly horizontally scalable, but in the SQL databases are only vertical scalable. So there is a limitation of scaling in and out your SQL database. But in NoSQL database you can add as many of the worker nodes in your cluster to make it a very highly scalable and in horizontal manner, which is a big plus point for every big data application. These are all the reasons NoSQL databases are very popular for every data driven application. Okay, so now let's talk about one of the most important concept in big data world, which is like a CAP theorem. So for a distributed databases, the CAP theorem states that it is impossible to simultaneously provide more than two out of these given guarantees. So all these guarantees are consistency, availability, and the partition tolerance. So the consistency means that every read receives the most recent write or an error. So which means that all the nodes in the network will see the same data at the same time. That is the meaning of consistency. Then comes the availability. So availability will guarantee you that every request which receives a response about whether it was successful or failed. However, it does not guarantee that a read request will return you the most recent write. So every non-failing node will returns a response for all the read and write operations in a very reasonable amount of time. And at the last we have the partition tolerance. So partition tolerance means that a system will continue operating even if the network connecting to the node has some fault, which will result in two or more partition where the node in each partition can only communicate with each other, which means that system will continue to function and it will uphold its consistency guarantees in spite of the network partitions. So these properties are very important for every distributed system. So based on this CAP theorem, different databases will pick different combination of consistency, availability, as well as the partition tolerance. So the relational databases will definitely comes in the CA category. So CA databases will give you the consistency as well as the availability, but it will not give you the partition tolerance. Means these databases are not that much suitable for handling big data. So if you have like billions of rows coming in with a higher pace, then you should definitely choose NoSQL databases over the SQL databases. And on the other hand, NoSQL databases will prioritize partition tolerance over consistency and the availability. So each NoSQL databases should give you the partition tolerance, which means that it will handle the big data better than any SQL databases in the market right now. So as you can see in this figure, the CP and AP, which are having the partition tolerance common in both these databases, we have the MongoDB on the CP side, which will give you the consistency with the partition tolerance, and the Cassandra, which will give you the availability with partition tolerance, and it will prioritize them above the consistency. And in CA category, where we have the consistency and the availability, you will be having all the different relational databases like the SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, Oracle SQL, and so on. So choosing the right database will totally depends on the type of application you are having. So if you want your system to be highly scalable, then you should choose NoSQL databases. But if you need like the consistency and availability at the same time, then the SQL database will be right choice for you. So CAP theorem is very important to choose your database for your application. So I hope you understood what are the different types of databases available in the market today and how they are classified into different categories and why they are comparing with each other in many categories. We have also seen some of the different types of NoSQL databases and the CAP theorem to choose the right database for your application. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. So please hit like and subscribe to the channel if you find this useful.